All right. There were 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. I hope you're all comfortable because we're going to sit here and examine the lives in each and every one of them in great detail.
Oh, boy.
No, I'm not going to do that to you. I will make a note that there's a lot of information that we'd sort of consider, normal. Date of birth, date of death, where they went to school, all kinds of stuff that's really missing from a bunch of these folks. So some of the information is spotty. So within the list of what we've got, this is what we're going to be talking about. Let's see, here we go. This is the Independence Hall at the signing of the Declaration, okay? And this was done by somebody named Ralph Tremblay after John Trumbull's original. I picked this one to show you because the Trumbull original, the colors are much darker. I figured this one would show up more. But this is supposed to be Independence Hall as they are presenting the completed declaration to the Assembly in order to vote on and sign it. And why did I pick the men that we're going to talk about specifically? Because their lives appealed to me for one reason or another. A lot of this information comes from the book Lives of the Signers. There's more that comes from Conservapedia, and there's a website from the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they have biographies. There's all kinds of really, really nice information online. There were 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Most of them had voted for independence. Some of them were not there yet, but they signed when they got there. There were some others who had voted but who were recalled and didn't sign. Others voted, one had refrained from voting because he wanted independence himself and supported it fully. But his constituents were not yet at the place where they fully supported independence. So he refrained from signing until the approval came from his district, and after that he was willing to sign. Every single one of these men were putting their own lives, their livelihoods, their property, and their family at risk to take this step. And no, they were not all wealthy slave owners. They had, and this is one of the wonderful things about America. Anyone born in Europe, and still to this day in most of the rest of the world, whatever your father did, that was your profession. If you didn't like it, that's a shame. Too bad. Yeah, that's what you're going to do for the rest of your life anyways. Here in America, they changed professions. They studied for one thing, they ended up something else, they got a chance to try yet another thing, they swapped around. So they had a lot of professions. I listed 72 different professional occupations for the 56 signers. They had wildly different educational backgrounds, from no formal education to sent off to Europe, Britain and Europe, for education at the most prestigious of universities of the time. 12 of them were either the sons or grandsons of ministers. And a lot of them were active abolitionists before the Revolutionary War. More of them became abolitionists as they thought about and presented and debated the principles that were in the Declaration that they'd signed. And an awful lot of them either lost family or property during the war. All of them had some sort of civil office in government during the war. A lot of them fought in the war. So here's their pre-war professions. After the war, that we end up with an awful lot of people who were very important in the government under the Articles of Confederation and under the Constitution. So there were doctors, accounting clerks, ministers, either farmers or gentlemen farmers, a shoemaker, teachers or professors. 3 of them, there's no record of what they did for a living. A shipbuilder, merchants, lawyers, businessmen, surveyors, a poet. He also did something else, but there was one that was a poet, a printer. Anyone guess who the printer was? Benjamin Franklin, exactly. And a carpenter. Now, under lawyer, that category also includes people who were judges or justices of the peace, who were sort of magistrates who dealt with smaller local issues. A lot of them were homeschooled or self-taught. They had local schools, the little grammar school in their town, tutors. A whole bunch were sent to school. One of George Washington's sorrows in his life was that his older brother got to go to school in Britain. But before he was old enough to go, his father had died, and there wasn't enough money to send him as well. So one of the sorrows in his life was that he didn't get to go to school the way his older brother did. But a lot of them went to school in England, Scotland, Ireland, and France. Some of them went for what we would consider middle school and high school today. Others went for university. Some went for more advanced training, either in science, the law profession, and in medicine. And there were some that we don't know what they did, and a lot of them went to colleges or universities. And when I say this includes the Inns of Court, that was the advanced legal training. So in terms of other issues, there were 6 of the 56 that were actually noted as having been active in abolitionist circles before the Revolutionary War. There are strong indications that there were more who felt that way, but were not noted as being active. Keep in mind that in 1776, there were only a couple of places in the entire world where slavery was not legal, and those were 2 of the 13 colonies. You can look up where they were and when others joined them. 11 of them lost family or property during the war, and that is recorded. 15 of them actually actively fought and had positions of being officers in the militia or in the Revolutionary Army. And 57 held office during the Revolutionary War, some in their home state, some in their county, some had federal office, and sometimes more than one office at once. And that includes Robert Livingston, who was the one who withheld his signature because his constituents didn't support independence yet. So you'll have noticed that there was this big category called lawyer, which included judges and justices of the peace. Most of them, well, put it this way, there weren't any law schools at that time. So how did you become a lawyer when there isn't a law school? There's something called reading the law. And it's still legal and available in a couple of places in the US today. But it used to be the only way to become a lawyer. It involves basically apprenticing yourself or working under an experienced lawyer, and you would actually read the law and read the cases and learn how the workings of the law operated. There were some who did it completely on their own. Most of them did work under another lawyer. All right, let's get on to actual signers. Josiah Bartlett, and all you're going to see up is pictures. Some of these came from Conservapedia, some of them came from the Daughters of the Revolution website. There's a face that inspires confidence. Josiah Bartlett was born in Massachusetts in 1729. His antecedents had come from Normandy by way of England. His mother was a Webster of the family that later produced statesman Daniel Webster. He was homeschooled and privately tutored, and he never went to college, but he became a noted and very successful doctor. Again, back then, there weren't much in the way of medical schools. You studied under another doctor, or in his case, he studied on his own. He actually developed a treatment for something that was called throat distemper that was very deadly. It's now thought to be an exceptionally nasty form of either diphtheria or strep throat. Nobody actually really knows what it was. But throat distemper was very deadly, and he developed a treatment based on Peruvian bark, they called it. That's actually, that bark is still used today as an effective treatment, and specifically for malaria. It didn't cure the disease, but it alleviated the symptoms of suffocating long enough for people to heal. And one of the people that he saved by this treatment was his own son. He founded and was the first president of the New Hampshire Medical Society. And he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Medicine degree by Dartmouth College on the same day as his son Ezra received the degree in medicine that he had earned at that college. So that's kind of cool. He was elected to the New Hampshire legislature in 1765 and then was appointed by the royal governor as a justice of the peace. But Dr. Bartlett refused to swear allegiance to either the governor or the king. When Governor Wentworth dismissed the New Hampshire Assembly in 1774, Bartlett was elected to its successor, the Provincial Assembly, and this was all in complete defiance of the royal governor and considered extremely illegal at the time. His house was burned down by the Tories, and he declined becoming a delegate to the Continental Congress because they were still rebuilding. Governor Wentworth was expelled from New Hampshire in 1775, and one of his last acts was to revoke Bartlett's commissions as Justice of the Peace, Colonel in the Militia, and Assemblyman. Dr. Bartlett was sent as a delegate to the Continental Congress in 75 and 76. For a time, he was the only delegate from New Hampshire to attend. He was the first to be asked to vote yea or nay for independence and declared yea, and later signed the Declaration. He came home back home in 1777, and he accompanied John Stark's forces to the Battle of Bennington in August of that year, which the Americans won, in case you didn't know. He was reelected in 78, and he was one of the committee to draft the Articles of Confederation, which he also signed. After 1778, he stayed in New Hampshire. He became a judge. And then in 1782, he was appointed to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and in 1788, he became Chief Justice of the New Hampshire Supreme Court. Not bad for a boy who taught himself to be a doctor and then did a little bit of studying law on the side. He argued for ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788, and while the legislature selected him to be senator, he declined the office. You'll find that a lot if you study these folks. They get appointed by the legislature or the governor or something to some high office, and they go, no thanks, no, I don't need that. Somebody else should be doing it. I'm not the right person. He served as the New Hampshire Chief Executive, which was called the President of New Hampshire, from 1791 to 1792, and then as governor for another 2 years after the New Hampshire State Constitution went into effect. Under the Articles of Confederation and until the Constitution and then the different states ratified their own conventions, the chief executive of the state was called president of that state. During his time in office, he oversaw provisions for early repayment of the state debt. Now there's a concept. And he advocated strongly for New Hampshire agriculture, manufacturing, roads, and canals. He resigned in 1794 because his health was failing, and he died the following year. Stephen Hopkins. The hat apparently was a big trademark, and you'll see. So there are like no pictures of the man without a hat, and several of the biographies specifically talk about his hats. So Maybe he had a big bald spot. History does not record, but the hat was a big thing for him. He was born in Rhode Island in 1707. He was the grandson of a minister. He was self-taught. He was a farmer. Later on, he sold his farm and bought a store and became a merchant. And later, he became a shipbuilder. He was elected to the Rhode Island General Assembly in 1732, and he held that office until 1738. Then he went back in 1741 and was elected Speaker of the House. In the following 10 years, he remained in the Rhode Island House, and in 1751 became Chief Justice of the Rhode Island Colony. Again, not bad for a self-taught farmer, merchant, shipbuilder. He was a delegate to the Colonial Convention in 1754. He voted for and signed the Declaration of Independence, but he had to steady his right hand with his left because he had a palsy. And he said, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not." And if you look at his signature, you'll see it's a little shaky. He became governor of Rhode Island in 1756. He remained as governor until 67. He raised and led a volunteer corps for the French and Indian War, but they ended up not being needed and they got sent back home. But he tried. In 1774, he was the Chief Justice of Rhode Island. He was a representative in the Provincial Assembly and a delegate to the Continental Congress. He submitted a bill to the Rhode Island Assembly to prevent the importation of slaves very early on. And at that time, he also manumitted all the slaves he owned. Now, Rhode Island, northern, tiny Rhode Island, was the most active colony in the slave trade because it had a huge merchant fleet. It also had extremely strict slave control laws. So this was a big in-your-face step that he took doing this. Now, Rhode Island law at the time required a 100-pound bond be posted for every slave that was free, basically to make sure that they would never be a charity case. It was really expensive to free your slaves. At that time, a family, a nice big family, could live really, really well on 60 to 80 pounds a year. So almost double that for each slave you freed. It was a very expensive step to take. Really putting your money where your mouth is. All right, Mr. Hopkins was elected to the Continental Congress in 74. He signed the Declaration, and he was in office until 78. He was on the committee that wrote the Articles of Confederation, and he was also on the Naval Committee that developed plans for ship armaments. He retired in 78 when he was in his early 70s. As a couple of side notes, he was cousin to General Benedict Arnold, the one who turned traitor in 1780. Can you find Mr. Hopkins? Look for the hat. There he is. Very characteristic.
There's Waldo.
What?
There's Waldo. In this case,
Where's Waldo? Where's Hopkins? Waldo Hopkins. All right. Robert Morris of Pennsylvania. He was really fascinating to study. He was the financier of the Revolution. But he was born in England in 1734. He was raised by his maternal grandmother after his mother died when he was only 2. And he joined his father in Maryland in 1748. Only 2 years later, his father died following a freak accident. He had blood poisoning after the wad from a farewell salute. He was coming off a ship, and they did the farewell salute with the firearms. The wad that they rammed the powder in with went flying through the side of a boat and hit him, and he got blood poisoning from the wound and died. So that was a weird accident. His father was the first man to keep his merchant accounts in money rather than gallons, yards, weight, pounds. So that was a big step in terms of accounting for your wealth. Mr. Morris never finished school, and he was working as a clerk when his father died, and he was left all by himself at the grand old age of 16 on a new continent. Great. His partnership, Willing, Morris and Company, had 3 ships, because he inherited his father's shipping interest. They traded with Britain as well as participating in banking. He was with that company for almost 40 years and was one of the 2 wealthiest signers of the Declaration of Independence. When Britain forbade indentured servants, which was a step that the British took in order to push the more lucrative slave trade, they dropped that aspect of their business completely and brought in more workers from Europe instead. Later, he and his partner organized the first non-importation agreement, ending slave trade in the Philadelphia area. In 1775, he convinced the captain of the tea ship Polly to return to England, thereby avoiding a Philadelphia Tea Party. His company brought in weapons and powder for the militia, and his captains brought information on British troop movements. The Continental Congress posted guards at his wharf because so many crucial supplies came by way of his ships. He was elected to the Continental Congress in 75, and he hoped at that time for a peaceful resolution and left the hall on July 2nd when they voted so that he would not be forced to cast a dissenting vote. At the time, he thought it was the wrong time to be declaring independence. But he did sign, along with the rest, in unanimity with the desire of the rest of the colonies, on August 2nd. He stated that he was not one of those politicians that run testy when my own plans are not adopted. Additionally, he said it was the duty of every individual to act his part in whatever station his country may call him to. And so he acted until the peace in 1783. In 76, he was chosen to negotiate ways for the new government to get money to fight the war. He personally loaned $10,000 to the country at the end of 1776 and guaranteed, in effect, he co-signed many other loans during the course of the war. In 1781, he was put in charge of all war financing, and we ended the war with $2.5 million in debt, extensively backed, co-signed by Mr. Morris. He also instituted accounting procedures for the tracking all of this, and he purchased many of the supplies that were needed for the war himself. Pleading with the states to contribute. Remember, one of the problems was the Articles of Confederation is that the states would say the check's in the mail, but the money would never show up. So he said that pleading with the states to contribute was the same as preaching to the dead. Well over $1.4 million of his own money was used to fight the war. And while the country paid back loans to other lands, Mr. Morris literally lost a fortune. He also started the Bank of North America, which was the first U.S. chartered financial institution. The U.S. credit with other nations in Europe was established by him. He represented Pennsylvania in Congress. He served at the Constitutional Convention in '87. He and Roger Sherman of Connecticut were the only 2 men who signed all 3 founding documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. After the Constitution was adopted, he served as a U.S. Senator, serving on 41 committees, and he was the one who wrote to Washington to inform him that he had been selected as the first president. Washington appointed him Secretary of the Treasury, but he declined and recommended Alexander Hamilton instead. After he retired, and with his personal fortune greatly diminished, he ventured into sales of wild, undeveloped lands. In this, one of his 2 partners turned out to be a crook, and a big client in France, Talleyrand, reneged on a deal. At that point, he was seriously overextended, and he lost what was left of his fortune after a partisan lawsuit deprived him of hundreds of square miles of land that he might have been able to sell to recoup his holdings. He spent 3.5 years in debtor's prison. President Adams refused to pardon him, and it took Congress passing the Bankruptcy Act of 1800 to get him released. His wife was then able to get them a home to live in, and he spent his last 5 years poor but free, thanks to an annuity provided by Gouverneur Morris, who also was a signatory. Benjamin Rush of Pennsylvania, you've seen this picture already. He was known as the father of American medicine, and in addition to signing the Declaration, he served as the Surgeon General of the Continental Army. He founded the Philadelphia Bible Society and the Society for the Abolition of Slavery. He did not attend the Constitutional Convention, but he encouraged Pennsylvania to ratify it. His father was a farmer and a gunsmith, but died when Benjamin was only 6. His mother ran a grocery store and homeschooled her boys until they enrolled in a school that was run by their uncle. He went to Princeton as a junior at age 13 and graduated at 14, the youngest graduate ever, having demonstrated his knowledge, understanding, and comprehension of their 5-year curriculum, including fluency in Greek and Latin. He studied medicine with a doctor in Philadelphia for 6 years, then in Edinburgh, and he got his MD in 1768. He wrote the first American textbook on chemistry. He was sent to Congress in 76, representing Pennsylvania, in late July, so he didn't get to vote for the Declaration of Independence, but he did get to sign it. He wrote to John Adams in 1811, recalling the pensive and awful silence which pervaded the House when we were called up, one after another, to the table of the President of Congress to subscribe what was believed by many at that time to be our own death warrants. The silence and gloom of the morning was interrupted, I well recollect, only for a moment, by Benjamin Harrison of Virginia, who said to Elbridge Gerry at the table, "I shall have a great advantage over you, Mr. Gerry, for when we are all hung for what we are now doing, from the size and weight of my body I shall die in a few minutes, but from the lightness of your body you will dance in the air for an hour or two before you are dead." This speech procured a transient smile, but was soon succeeded by the solemnity with which the whole business was conducted. Dr. Rush traveled with the Army as a doctor, including the Battle of Trenton on December 24th, and he was with Washington there, December 24th of 76. His wife, with several of the other wives, went door to door raising money for the Army. He was made Surgeon General in 77 and later Physician General, and he took no pay. He resigned in 1778 in disgust when Congress did not act on his report of deplorable conditions under Dr. Shippen of the Army Medical Service. He supported the new Constitution. He served on the Pennsylvania Convention that adopted it for Pennsylvania. He was the one who resolved the discord between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and he remained a good friend to both of them. He served one term in Congress and returned to medicine. He founded a hospital and a free medical clinic for the poor. When the horrible yellow fever epidemics hit Philadelphia in 1793, he was one of the very few doctors who stayed in the city to fight the disease. And he died battling a typhus epidemic in 1813. When Rush died, Thomas Jefferson wrote John Adams that a better man than Rush could not have left us, more benevolent, more learned, of finer genius, or more honest. To which Adams replied, "He knew of no character, living or dead, who has done more real good in America." Adams wrote to Rush's widow, Julia, "There is no one outside my own family whose friendship was so essential to my happiness." Charles Carroll of Carrollton of Maryland. He was the last survivor of the 56. He was born in 1737 of Irish descent, purportedly from the O'Carroll Kings by way of Irish rebels, and he was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration. He was homeschooled, in part because of the restrictions on the rights of Catholics to education by Maryland. Then he was sent to school in Catholic France by a father who had done very well indeed, despite all those restrictions. He studied philosophy, poetry, and Roman law, and learned how philosophy, religion, and politics are all indicative of a society's evolution. He studied the works of Locke, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, and learned Republican principles from them. His studies also took him to the Inns of Court in London, where again he was restricted in what he could learn because of his religion. All these studies brought him to write in 1763 that the colonies will and must be independent. Back home in Maryland in 65, he took his place in society and in life, and kept an active interest in politics. In 72, he wrote a series of essays that he signed as the First Citizen against the British government taxing the colonies without consent. Early on, he realized that it would become necessary to resort to arms. In 75, he became a delegate to the Revolutionary Convention in Maryland and helped convince the colony to support independence. He was named a delegate to the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, so he wasn't able to vote for independence, but he signed on August 2nd most willingly. When John Hancock teased that he could escape prosecution because his not uncommon name would allow him to claim mistaken identity, he added the "of Carrollton." And he stood to lose well over £1 million personally should independence not carry the field. He served in Continental Congress, declined re-election. He was in the U.S. Senate representing Maryland. He was on the committee that approved the final wording for the Bill of Rights. He served in the Maryland State Senate. In the early 1820s, he wrote opposing slavery that it is admitted by all to be a great evil, and during his life, his own ownership of slaves troubled him. Maryland law prohibited manumission of slaves by will. It also prohibited removing slaves from Maryland if the intention was to free them. As with several of the signers, he was caught between his principles and the dictates of his state's unjust laws. He died at 96 in 1832, the last surviving signer. George Wythe of Virginia. Now, does he not look like a wild party animal, or does he not look like a wild party animal? Because he was.
Okay.
He was born in 1726 of wealthy parents, and his father died when he was only 3. His mother homeschooled him, including instruction in Latin and Greek, but she died when he was only 16. His older brother inherited everything, and George went to William and Mary College, dropped out for lack of money, and spent 2 years studying law under his uncle. He married at 21, and his wife died only 7 months later from a fever. He spent much of the next decade partying, trying to drown his sorrows in the various taverns of his county. These activities did not stop him from being a clerk for the House of Burgesses. Somewhere around age 30, he got ready and he put aside the party life and started taking his life seriously. He was selected as a regular member of the House of Burgesses in 1755, and later that year his older brother died, so he inherited the family farm. He also remarried that year. He became a professor of law at William and Mary. This was part of the regular courses. They didn't have a separate law school. And his students included Thomas Jefferson, Henry Clay, Kentucky senator, and the one who wrote part of the Missouri Compromise, James Monroe, and John Marshall, who was Secretary of State under Adams and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He also founded a private school where he taught, which was free to anyone who showed promise and would work hard. He was long in favor of independence. In 75, he was elected to the Virginia Provincial Congress and then as a delegate to the Continental Congress. During the debates, he stated, "In what character shall we treat? As subjects of Great Britain? As rebels? Why should we be so fond of calling ourselves dutiful subjects? We must declare ourselves as a free people." He was instrumental at the convention in the selection of Jefferson, Franklin, and Silas Deane as ambassadors to France. Once he returned to Virginia, he assisted then Governor Patrick Henry as his position as Speaker of the House, and he stayed in Williamsburg despite the danger of capture during the war. He became a justice of the highest court of Virginia, the Chancery Court, and served till 1788. He was a delegate to the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 1787, but he returned home when his wife became ill, and she died in August of that year. He did go to the convention to ratify the new state constitution. He served as an elector under the Constitution and voted for his former student, Tommy Jefferson. Because of the principles in the Declaration of Independence, Mr. Wythe, who was a slave owner, gradually changed his opinions and became an abolitionist. His belief in freedom for all cost him his life. His nephew learned of provisions in Wythe's will to split his inheritance with a to-be former slave, Michael Brown. He was going to give half of his goods to Michael Brown, as well as freeing all the remaining slaves that he had. So the nephew poisoned Mr. Wythe and Michael Brown, and also Lydia Broadnax, who was the housekeeper, with arsenic. The two men died. The nephew stood trial for murder and was acquitted when the testimony of the Negro housekeeper was disallowed. However, his tactics did not win him a fat inheritance because Mr. Wythe had written his nephew out of his will shortly before the incident. After his death, many took pains to laud his honesty, integrity, warm-heartedness, benevolence, and hard work. He had bequeathed all his books to Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's collection eventually ended up in the Library of Congress, so that's where Wythe's books are as well. Not bad for a partier. Benjamin Harrison of Virginia. Just a little bit about him, more about his descendants. His third son later became President William Henry Harrison. He was only president for a month and died of pneumonia. President William Henry Harrison's grandson became President Benjamin Harrison. This guy himself was the oldest of 10 children. He was sent to William and Mary College, where he met both Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, but he had to leave and take over after the family interests after his father and 2 sisters died in their house from a lightning strike during a violent thunderstorm. He was still a minor, but he managed the family estate with skill. We're going to run out of time, so I'll skip the rest of him. Button Gwinnett of Virginia. He's an object lesson in not learning your principles. He was born in England and was apprenticed to a merchant in Bristol. He completed his apprenticeship, married, and moved to South Carolina and later to Georgia. He became persuaded of the rightness of the American stance against the crown. In '76, he was elected to represent Georgia at the Continental Congress. He voted for independence and signed the Declaration. However, he seems not to really have gotten the whole all men are created equal thing. Many of those who were born in England were accustomed to looking down on colonists as their inferiors. Oh, colonists. This rose up to bite him big time. He was a candidate for the office of Brigadier General in the Army, but a colonial, a Colonel McIntosh, who had been his friend, was selected instead, and Mr. Gwinnett took this as a personal affront, and thereafter considered Mr. McIntosh as a personal enemy who had bested the superior man. He ended up challenging McIntosh to a duel after McIntosh publicly called Gwinnett a scoundrel. Now, if he'd been Han Solo, he would have thought, a scoundrel? But Mr. Gwinnett took this as an insult. They had a duel, both men were wounded, and Gwinnett died. Bad button, no biscuit. George Walton of Virginia, he's our final signer. I picked him because in many ways he's the quintessential man, American self-made man. He was born in Virginia in 1741. He was orphaned by age 7 and lived with his uncle. At 14, he was apprenticed to a carpenter who was utterly ignorant and who thought that education was just an excuse for slacking off and that time spent studying was wasted. Walton was denied any time to read during the day, and he was even denied candles to study with at night, so he read by torchlight and firelight. After finishing his apprenticeship, he couldn't get out of there fast enough. He moved to Georgia and read law under a barrister named Young. He passed the bar and commenced his law practice in 1774. Georgia did not send any delegates to the General Congress in '74, and Walton worked hard for the next 2 years, and in February '76, Georgia decided to join the rest of the colonies. They sent 5 delegates to the Continental Congress, and Mr. Walton was one of these 5. He voted for and signed the Declaration, and was appointed a colonel in the militia in '78. He was wounded in defense of Savannah. He was taken prisoner and exchanged in a prisoner swap the following year. In 1779, he became a member of Congress. He was appointed Chief Justice of Georgia in 1783, and he held that position for life. He served as an elector in 1789, and he was also elected the governor of Georgia. During his term, Georgia adopted a new state constitution. In 1798, he was elected senator, which office he held for 1 year, and then he retired except for his duties as a judge. He died in 1804, having achieved far more than an ill-used carpenter's apprentice could have expected in any other country in the world then or now. That's it. You can read about the rest of them. Again, Lives of Designers, they've got them over there. Fabulous book.